So hopefully my sound works and everything is going good. I moved my setup. So, yeah, some new news. They got this UAPTF, UAP task force for the Pentagon. Apparently, they hired a chief scientist, and then George Knapp just found out who it was. This is pretty cool. Let's. I think I have to share a screen and do Chrome tab. Yeah, this one. So you can get the sound. Did I click the button? I don't know if I did or not. Oh, God. Yeah, share audio.
Spoke exclusively about his investigations with the I-Team's George Knapp.
Set up over close to the doorway.
Television viewers know astrophysicist Dr. Travis Taylor as an intrepid investigator of UFOs and the paranormal at Skinwalker Ranch and on other History Channel programs. Only a handful of people in the world knew that Taylor was leading a double life, secretly working as the chief scientist for the Pentagon's UAP task force.
But I would say, other than the people who already knew on the task force, you're the first person to figure it out, George.
As a scientific prodigy, Taylor earned advanced degrees at a young age and has spent his entire adult life working on classified projects, first for the U.S. Army, then for defense contractors. He wrote a book about how the U.S. government should prepare for alien contact, which caught the attention of Jay Stratton, a high-ranking intelligence official who's been involved with each of the Pentagon's secretive UFO investigations, including OSAP, based in Las Vegas, ATIP, its successor, and later took charge of a third effort, the UAP task force, even before that team was formally created by Congress.
Jay Stratton, the director of the UAP task force, asked me if I would be interested in being the chief scientist. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Of course I would.
One of the primary jobs of the task force was to write a report to Congress summarizing the known evidence about UFOs. The team had already created a classified briefing consisting of the most intriguing military encounters, starting with the 2004 Tic Tac incident. The task force whittled down a huge database into 144 of the very best cases. Dr. Taylor helped write the final report.
But we picked sources that we knew had a chain of custody of the data. And out of those 144, 143 of them, we still couldn't figure out what they were, where they came from, and what their intent was.
Civilian debunkers have tried to explain away the Tic Tac and gimbal UFOs as birds or reflected light or far-off jet engines, as if military investigators were oblivious to such possibilities. When the UAP task force determined objects to be genuine unknowns, it wasn't merely relying on video clips for evidence.
Here's the thing, a skeptic and a debunker, they take their results by starting from the beginning, by knowing that the result is going to be this. So they take the analysis to lead them in the direction to do that. And the data that we had, in many cases, there was more of it than what the general public has and what was released. And so when we say that we had a thing that was from multiple sensors and it told us multiple things, and we also had eyewitness accounts, audio information, and so on.
Taylor and the task force spent 3 years analyzing the 144 incidents, including dozens of bizarre objects that buzzed multiple Navy ships in 2019. Some of them were spheres that swarmed and kept pace with the warships. Others appeared to be greenish pyramids.
At time 0424 Zulu.
Task force members were stunned to hear a Navy official tell a congressional hearing last month that all of these were, quote, drones, as if the mystery had been solved. Someone had to disregard the work of the task force to make that claim.
We had a lot of sensor data on some of them that we couldn't determine what they are. I mean, if it's our near peers doing it, that's scary. But at the same time, we also never found any evidence that it was our near peers doing it.
The drone conclusion was reached after the UAP task force was done and before the new UFO program, AIMSOG, even started. So who did it? George Knapp, 8 News Now.
George Knapp, 8 News Now. All right, so that was the big reveal, is that, oh, God, Travis Taylor. It turns out Travis Taylor was working secretly for the UAP task force the entire time. This was on Troubled Minds. Thank you for sharing that video from yesterday with us. Yeah, Travis S. Taylor. Here's his Wikipedia page. Interesting guy. Super interesting dude. Yeah, I just actually reached out to him, not knowing that he was this guy and he was the key. I was like, yeah, we got to get a hold of this Travis Taylor dude. And I just emailed him and asked him to be a guest on the show, so we can ask him some more scientific questions about some of his work and some of his research into all this stuff. Be cool to get his take on a lot of these things, man, because I'd like to see. He worked in some of this beamed, space-based beamed propulsion. It says space-based beamed energy systems. So, either solar collectors in space that beam the power to Earth, like microwave satellite power plants, or also high-energy lasers and stuff. Love to get his take on some of these technologies that we talk about on the show, like stuff from his colleague, some of the other guys who worked on some of the Star Wars missile defense kind of stuff, like Kevin Kremeyer and Lake Marabou of NASA, who's worked with NASA and is still under NDA till like 2027. Some of these guys we'd love to get on and talk to and hear some information about. But yeah, Travis Taylor, interesting dude. I'd love to see what he has to say about all these other theories of what these things could be, and the data. I mean, without revealing too much about our sensor data, because there's obviously a lot of classified intelligence on what types of sensors we have for detecting incoming flying objects and stuff, if he was director of such a classified program and stuff. But it's also interesting, from an intelligence perspective, that the guy involved with the Skinwalker Ranch stuff, which they funded some of this far out stuff under this ATIP program, and these government studies that were done under the Defense Intelligence Agency. And they funded a lot of weird stuff that, maybe was a waste of time, but maybe not. And I don't know, I'd love to see what this Travis Taylor has to say about, all this junk science, the dino beavers, and, everything going on at Skinwalker Ranch, because he supposedly, was studying that stuff. We're eventually going to move into this interview, which is 100,000 views now. Dr. Brian Keaton recently interviewed Eric Weinstein and Avi Loeb. This was a really great collaboration of guests, and it was quite interesting, but we're going to get to that in a second. I want to play Stephen Greer first. Hold on, let me share the audio on this one. The dark side. The dark side.
This is one of the cautionary tale. When Stan Meyer's collection of technologies were acquired by this other entity, and I said, whoever gets it, tell them they have to do it open source, in front of the whole world. The whole world's going to be watching this technology being refined, developed, released, without any intellectual property for that, without patent, because otherwise they're not going to survive their launch. I got this call a couple years later, who had ended up being the money behind that acquisition. And he says, these people are running for their lives. They are looking for an eco-friendly country that they can get to because they're being threatened in America. I said, you'd have to go to another star system. There's no place on this planet where the henchmen of these kind of Fourth Reich fascists won't find you. And they didn't want to let go of the greed and profit motive. They wanted to be the next Rockefellers of energy, you see. So that is the Achilles heel. Next thing I know, I meet with a guy in Orange County, California, who knew one of the people who was with that engineering team. And the man said this guy came in, was crying like a baby because every single one of them had been killed and the technology vanished.
Yeah, that's interesting claims. I would like to know more about this engineer and who else was killed. I know there's some interesting and strange coincidences of people that have been, killed, who are working on free energy or free energy devices and stuff. Namely, guys like Eugene Malov. An interesting case. They never did catch the guys that killed Eugene Malov, but he was a cold fusion scientist from MIT. And the guys who discovered cold fusion at BYU down in Utah, actually Pons and Fleischmann, they ended up moving to France and doing their research in France. And they formed a whole institute and got funding from the French government to continue their cold fusion research. And that's where I believe they died and retired. But yeah, so there's other countries that are friendly to this type of stuff or have been friendly to alternative energies and stuff. So I don't know. I'm curious to what Stephen Greer is saying, and I would like to, interview him as well and get some more information from him. This is interesting. This is his most recent video. Oh.
All right. I'm going to assume then that you're not going to take up Dr. Stephen Greer on his offer to have a online live debate on third phase of moon then.
Who's Greer?
There you go.
I'm kidding. Look, I don't negotiate with terrorists. Bottom line.
Yeah, he's got some issues. He told me, like he says, he doesn't negotiate with terrorists.
Yes, well, I mean, myself and some people working for me have been called terrorists, every other thing, traitors, because we're not willing to go along with this corrupt game, and we call it out.
Dr. Stephen Greer coming at you at different angles and all the sublets that they have around them coming at you. I mean, how hard is that to deflect all of that pressure?
I don't know what to tell you, man, but look, Heaven's Gate and Jim Jones comes to mind.
Insane. The moral high ground that he thinks he occupies in this situation.
I think it's turning people against each other. You have these five guys, and they have a narrative. They're not moving from it, and it's not the truth.
He will never debate with anyone that has any knowledge. And for him to say that
ain't that the truth?
A terrorist or is someone who is lacking in knowledge or truth is ridiculous. It's preposterous.
Well, Lou's like, where everyone's tired of Lou now at this point with all the I can't talk about this and I need to say this, and they still got a bunch of people cheering for him to be, testify at these congressional hearings or everything. But I say that that's all being set up. That's all a ruse to set it up so that their CIA guy can get in there and promote official mainstream narrative. And I wonder about this too, about what's going on with. I'd like to get Brian Keaton. Seems like a neutral party in all this, but I'm not so sure about Avi Loeb and Eric Weinstein. Eric Weinstein's partners with the Capitol guy there, who was just recently at Bilderberg, his partner there. So I don't know. Eric's been interesting. He did actually respond to me at one point on Twitter. I sent him stuff, and I sent him all kinds of stuff, but he doesn't respond. And then I sent him one random thing, and he did respond to me finally, and I was like shocked. But it's like, why do you respond to that and not all the other great stuff that I sent you? But yeah, I don't know about these two guys, but this is a great interview. Nonetheless, they made a lot of really excellent points that I could not disagree with.
several days at two physics conferences at UCLA that V. Byrne was organizing. And in the first one, 1,000 years ago,
Here.
has capabilities that we lack. I mean, an example of this would be like the Antikythera mechanism, which was discovered in a shipwreck dive where it was human civilization, but one far more advanced than any we had known about like 1,000 years ago. So the scientific method has to be extended. One of the reasons I'm interested in the Galileo project is the discussion about what is the responsible extension of the scientific method. It's also the case, for example, if you look at cuttlefish skin, it's probably the most advanced camouflage system found in nature. What if somebody, so in the UFO, UAP world, that would be called signature management. And what would it be like to study something that doesn't want to be studied, is more advanced than you are, is studying you while you are studying it, and knows physical laws that you know nothing of? I just spent several days at two physics conferences at UCLA that V. Byrne was organizing. And in the first one, Nima Arkani-Hamed from the Institute for Advanced Study brought up one of his favorite points, which is the demise of space-time. That space-time is doomed and it is only going to be seen in the future as an emergent mathematical structure, a map which is not the territory. The interesting thing about that.
You guys see that? I don't know if I'm sharing the Chrome tab properly. Let's see if I share the audio.
That, though, is if you take the point of view that space-time is merely an effective theory, then you have to ask yourself the question, does the theory that renders space-time an effective theory, that contains space-time, does that have new degrees of freedom that something else can get access to, and that we're trapped in this much lower dimensional, more compressed effective theory, while something else is aware of a more fundamental theory? And in that paradigm, the scientific method is relatively mute on most of these topics. So we tend to believe that we're in general position, we're smarter than what we're studying, we can repeat it many times at will. And all of these things have to be adjusted. Now, we've met that a little bit with respect to things like the Big Bang and the surface of last scattering, and I think Avi made a really brilliant point, although he made it in a way that I might slightly disagree with, but the point is much better than my disagreement. The point is that intelligence may be much rarer than fusion, which I totally agree with, and I think that that's a really interesting thing. But it may be also that the reason that we have summoned something to our shores is that we've indicated something that we do not know. We may think physics is going to go on forever, and whatever it is that may be watching us may know exactly how close we are to parity with it. So rather than it being tens of millions of years more advanced than ourselves, which is very much in keeping with the zeitgeist of today. The zeitgeist of today is against individual achievement. It's against the triumph of human intelligence. It's against the idea of power laws where certain people are much more productive than teams of others, et cetera, et cetera. This thing may know that we are much farther along and much more of a threat to it than we know we are. If you think about it, what if you suddenly found that orcas had developed opposable flippers and were just miles ahead of what we thought large dolphins could do in the sea? It would give us a huge shock. What I think is that it is entirely possible that whatever the successor to space-time is allows for things that we can't yet think about, and that it may be that we're a lot farther towards learning our fundamental truth than we know, and that may be of interest to something watching us.
Yeah, if I may add to what Eric just said, the one thing that marks the current time is the development of AI, artificial intelligence system, that may be eventually similar to the human mind. And you just, if you ever pushed a baby in a stroller on the street, you would recognize that the baby, when it passes by other babies, finds them much more interesting than yourself. Therefore, if we are dealing with AI astronauts,
But Avi,
AI,
my baby likes the toaster oven better than me. So it's not saying much.
but my point is simple that we are used to Darwinian evolution here on Earth, where random processes select the fittest, the survival of the fittest, and in fact, the extension of that, once we started developing technologies, technological selection, not natural selection, but technological selection in interstellar space. It's those gadgets that are autonomous, don't need guidance from their senders. Then their senders may be dead by now. These are AI astronauts. And they may be also our destiny, our future. If we send out those monuments of sentient AI systems to space, I can guarantee that to you that they are much better than the monuments you find for example, Harvard Square, Harvard Yard, which are monuments of past presidents and deans that try to preserve their physical image. These are static sculptures, and when kids pass by them, they usually yawn. And my point is that sending AI astronauts is our future, and it may have been the future of other civilizations because most of the sun-like stars formed billions of years before the sun, so they were just ahead of us.
And one thing I wanted to ask you, I've been working on it in my mind since you and I had a chance to talk over a year ago when you launched the Galileo project and gave me that scoop that I appreciate so much. And that was with reference to the fact that we don't seem to see aliens in our solar system. And the reason I think that's significant in the context of what Fred Hoyle and others called panspermia seems to be, at least at some level, capable of establishing an upper limit on evolutionary fecundity in some way. In other words, we've had life on Earth for how long, Avi? 4 billion years, 3 billion years, something like that?
Yeah, hundreds of millions of years. It started hundreds of millions of years after the Earth cooled. So
yeah,
it
so
was
it's
really quick.
Billions,
very.
Yeah. And it's efficient once it gets started and replication occurs and information storage obeys. Now, we haven't searched everywhere, and your friend Carl Sagan that we spoke about, I have a finger puppet of him here. He said absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. He said all sorts of things, like Feynman. I love when people quote Feynman. He'll say something like, if you can't explain it to your grandmother, you don't understand it. And then he'll say, if I could explain it to you, a newspaper reporter, it isn't worth a Nobel Prize. So I don't want to make too much of these great, people in the pantheon of science in history. But the fact that
I don't know about that, man. It wasn't Nobel Prize, after the guy who invented dynamite, Dynamite's not like super confusing, But yeah, I don't know.
You don't see any life on anywhere else in the solar system even. Can that be used to set some kind of a limit on the ability for us to, place Bayesian priors on the likelihood of finding life outside the solar system, let alone technological life? Or am I just way off here?
No, I mean, it's life can be very subtle. For example, it can be under the ice of Enceladus or Europa, and we haven't drilled the ice yet to find out if there is any fish in the ocean under it. There were some astronomers suggesting last year that perhaps there is life in the clouds of Venus. So these are very exotic environments, and the life would be quite different than we find here on Earth. But I think we are really at the infancy of searching, and it may be different from Earth for sure, because the physical conditions there are different. So it's sort of like going on a date without knowing what your date would look like. And so you're looking around the room, and it doesn't look like it's a human. There is a human like yourself out there, but that doesn't mean that your date is not next to you in some different form,
Yeah. So, Eric, when we think about the kind of motivation, perhaps, of journalists or other non-government organizations, how do you actually assess this? You've been very vocal about the need, as you just articulated, to not humiliate people. It's not part of science, but journalists aren't scientists, right? They're the first to admit that, hopefully. What standards of journalism do you think there need to be, if any, to report on such things without, encouraging ridicule and the prosthetic forehead problem of, that is worthy of ridicule at some level? What do you think can be done about this in the public social media sphere, et cetera?
I don't know where good journalism is still being done. I mean, I sometimes look at Quanta and think highly of what's written there. But in general, I've sort of just become aghast at what Twitter has done to journalists, where we now have basically activists recruited as journalists because it can sell legacy media. Obviously, the right thing is professional standards, which are tacit understandings of what you cannot do. And I'm concerned that there's something about our phones that makes everything tend in the direction of interpersonal drama. And in order to get funding, in order to get coverage, this has to become about, is so-and-so's reputation on the rocks? Tune in next week when we'll hear, and this is nonsense. It's completely antithetical to what science is. When I look at the G-2 muon anomaly in the discussion I was just listening to for several days, you have these collegial groups that are, sort of at each other's throats, but everything is extraordinarily professional and careful, and that whatever rivalries there are not at this lunch table level. So I think that the basic issue is we've just got to get rid of the emphasis on people who go after other people because they can't do their job either as scientists or as journalists covering science. And we need to replace them with better paid people in trusted positions who weigh things. And it's also, I just wanted to say that there's one other community that I'm going to call out, and I don't want to get into specifics, but the debunking community is really disappointing, because what it's doing is it's crowding out critique. And critique really matters. And snark and debunking and dragging and all of this dunking on stuff is some sort of abomination.
Hey, what's up, Bernie?
We need to get rid of.
Yeah,
what I'm curious about right now is, what is our best data? Who holds it? Who may see it? I applaud Avi's attempt to say we should get our own data. But it's also completely ridiculous that a small number of government physicists, determined by their security clearances rather than by their facility with equations, seems to be in charge of this as their portfolio. And what I would say is that it's really important for really prominent names in the theory community to start calling for an unsealing of this stuff. And I have to say that I'm very suspicious of a government trying to keep a secret and a legion of journalists who seem to be helping them by stigmatizing anyone who asks for the secret. So I just want to take a couple of other things that are really interesting. Peter Daszak was clearly doing something in Wuhan with this virus. We haven't held hearings. We haven't figured it out. Jeffrey Epstein was doing something trafficking children under everybody's noses. No journalist has called for even the bare minimum examination of documents related to what is probably a fictional hedge fund and whether or not he was tied to the intelligence community. The firebombing of the federal courthouse in Portland was not covered in real time in a meaningful way, given the level of violence being done to a federal building. In all of these circumstances, whether it's Hunter Biden's laptop, we've seen something really interesting, which is the appearance of anti-interesting stories that our professional legacy media refuses to cover, no matter how much interest is expressed by the population, and which is later found
like
that
all the
whatever
technologies
the
we
attempt to
talk
stigmatize
about.
the story, there was far more there in all of these cases than anyone had imagined. So I think we now have to look at the UFO UAP story in light of all of these other stories. I am absolutely positive that people were trying to firebomb the federal courthouse in Portland, and that for some reason MSNBC was not keen to cover it, just the way they weren't keen to cover Andrew Yang's presidential run. Something is happening in our journalistic layer, which is causing stories to be anti-interesting. And there's nothing more anti-interesting than Jeffrey Epstein and UFO UAP.
when I
Well,
think about that. Okay, go
I
ahead,
can,
Javier.
That's right.
because moving away
Well
from
said.
politics into science and academia, okay? And the same approach that Eric is worried about in the context of politics and the media, you can find among mainstream scientists. So on the one hand, ridiculing the study of UAP, even though there is data and evidence, and science is all about collecting more evidence if some evidence looks intriguing. That's all that science is about, evidence. Whereas, while ridiculing that, maintaining a mainstream that is focused on extra dimensions for which we have no evidence, focused on some notions of space and time that were never validated by any experiment, that never made a prediction that was confirmed. And yet awards and honors are given to mainstream scientists just for proposing them, and then to other mainstream scientists just for invalidating them experimentally. And one example was large extra dimensions. You know, the person who proposed it got a prize, and the person who did an experiment later to show that there cannot be a large extra dimension got a prize. So I said, we went full circle here, and we've proven that an idea is not correct. So why was it in the mainstream to start with? And what you find is a lot of the activity in theoretical astrophysics, theoretical physics, is rooted in ideas that were never tested, never validated. So I said, that's perfectly fine. You know, we can think about possibilities. That's perfectly fine. But at the same time, when there is intriguing evidence, to dismiss it and ridicule it, that's inappropriate. This is a culture that prefers to live in a virtual reality. Basically, ideas that bring you pleasure. It's just like putting goggles on your head and living in the metaverse where you are the smartest scientist in the world. But that's not the way science should be done. You should be wrong every now and then by comparing your ideas to data. And that's, you know, you should be bruised sometimes because you propose something that turns out to be wrong. And the only way to allow that is to follow data, to look for evidence. And the strange thing is that not accepting that rule and basically asking how many angels can sit on the tip of a dance on the tip of a pin, that's especially in extra dimensions, that's a completely acceptable mathematical intellectual gymnastics exercise that a lot of communities can agree on and give each other. But when you ask yourself, how can that replace this seeking experimental test? That looks to me very much, you know, the science is supposed to teach the public and government how to deal with evidence. So scientists very often say, oh, the government doesn't pay attention to evidence, doesn't pay attention to data. But if you look at the academic community, it's actually worse. And I ask myself, how is that possible? We're supposed to set an example by which we follow evidence. If there are UAP that look intriguing, we say, okay, that's interesting, let's figure it out. You know, that's the way scientists should approach it. But instead, no, the data is uninteresting, it's not real, forget about it, let's just work on extra dimensions. Like I say, that's completely opposite to what scientists should do.
Well, I don't know if I push back with respect, as you know. And I do feel like it's a little bit of a straw man to suggest that somebody could pivot from extra dimensions to doing the type of astronomy that even you don't do, Avi. I mean, you're not actually sitting at a telescope every night. I mean, you're a theoretical astrophysicist of the highest order, and you've written on this, and you know the astronomical technology.
The question is not what I do. The question is, what do I value? Okay, and I value evidence. And when there is intriguing evidence, I will not ridicule the evidence just to continue to work on some hypothetical idea. So the real issue is that some people within our community prefer to work on theoretical ideas just because they flatter their ego, and they prefer to shy away from data. I'm not talking about 1 year, 2 years. I'm talking about 4 decades. We're talking about the career of many scientists. Yeah.
Okay. The funny problem that we have here is that we poke holes for certain conspiracies, certain outlandish ideas, and not others, right? So there are various outlandish ideas that you're allowed to discuss in public, including conspiracies, like that Russia is running the United States through Donald Trump. That was an allowable conspiracy, that he was a foot soldier of Putin. But then there are conspiracies that you're not allowed to. Now, the same thing is true for scientific theories. There are outlandish scientific theories that have somehow diplomatic immunity from the regular scientific process and others that do not. And so we have hyper scrutiny for some and extremely lax relaxation of the rules for others. And this is in part a mystery that there is no real scientific method that's generating this concept of the mainstream. If leading people want to work on something outlandish, that outlandish thing becomes the mainstream. And if certain people want to take a look at evidence and go through absolutely normal scientific channels to look at something that people don't want discussed, that becomes aberrant, fringe, weird, cranky behavior. Now, the fact is that that doesn't really have a lot to do with any objective standard. It has to do with the fact that there is an Overton window in science, just the way there is in political discourse. And, you know, if you wanted to study what causes ulcers and you didn't believe it was stress, you had to experiment on yourself at some point because that was so much a part of the orthodoxy. In all of these situations where you've seen something fall, something outlandish, we saw this with the asymmetry of the weak force. The evidence was accumulating, but it was just this thing where nobody wanted to say the weak force has no clothes. You know, it was an emperor that we dare not question. And so in a certain sense, it's not really about extra dimensions or UFO, UAP. The question is, are we as scientists allowed to say, hey, why is string theory allowed to go on this way, or large extra dimensions, or loop quantum gravity, but not UAP, UFO, even to gather data to dismiss it by saying we had sensors up and we found nothing?
I want to
So
ask
I think,
that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
just to close it out, I think that the real issue is it's a little disturbing to many of us that there are allowable relaxations of the scientific method, and there are extremely harsh applications of scientific standards that are wielded selectively, like a cop in a town, you know, penalizing people who look a certain way and enforcing the speed limit extremely aggressively and letting other people speed through at 100 miles an hour and doffing their cap to them, encouraging them on their way. That's a real problem that we haven't addressed and nobody really wants to take up.
So I want to ask Avi, you know, as a professional courtesy, what do you mean by data? I mean, I have here, I'm in my office that used to belong to Jeff and Margaret Burbidge, towering titans of astronomy and physics of the past 100 years. Here's a plate she took on at Lick Observatory. It's a galaxy. She eventually did a rotation curve. Here's the spectrum of it. On one hand, you know, these are smudges on pieces of glass that are very fragile. On the other hand, they're pretty pictures. And on the other hand, they're data. And I want to ask you, when I hear colleagues say we need data and the data need to be public, and God damn it, the Hubble Space Telescope was built by NASA and I own it. What is data? I mean, the Hubble Deep Field is a pretty picture. There's very little science. Correct me if I'm wrong, Avi. I'll defer to you, you know, if I'm wrong. But, you know, it's a pretty picture. There is data. There is evidence that can be extracted to look at distributions and number counts and colored magnitude diagrams. You can do all sorts of things with it, but if you don't have the calibration, the flat field, the dark current, if you don't have all the stuff that goes into it. So I want to ask you, what data are we really talking about? I mean, is it cell phone camera videos? Is it like eyewitness reports? What is it exactly, Avi? And then I'd like to hear Eric's take on this.
So what I mean by data is the accumulation of quantitative signals that are collected and documented by instruments that you have full control over and whose background you understand, okay? So it cannot be a camera in a jittery cockpit of a fighter jet. It cannot be the pilot because people are not instruments. They have hallucinations, they have wishful thinking. So you cannot write a scientific paper saying, this person told me that. I'm sorry, I mean, even if the person is sincere, that cannot be used in a scientific peer-reviewed journal, okay? So what I mean by data is, first of all, you build instruments that you fully understand in terms of what is the background noise in the instrument so that you can detect a signal. And then you let the instrument do its job and report back the numbers that it measured. And then you interpret those. And that's what the Galileo project is trying to do. We were asked, why aren't we crowdsourcing or providing people an app that they will put on their iPhone so that they will give us data. This is low quality data that we have no control over. We would rather build instruments that we fully understand under conditions that are fully under our control, and then interpret the data that they collect, because then we can say, look, this instrument saw an object, let's say in the infrared, another instrument detected the same object in the optical. The object was moving along the same trajectory in both instruments. It cannot be malfunction of the instrument. And we know the acceleration cannot be produced by human-made vehicles. And it cannot definitely be representative of a bird, because we know the distance to this object. So these are the kinds of measurements that will tell us it's something else. Or if we have a high resolution image where we can see the bolts and the screws on the surface of the object, so it cannot be natural. A rock doesn't have bolts and screws on it. Or if we go and do an expedition to Papua New Guinea, where we collect the fragments from the first interstellar meteor that landed there in 2014, and then we find that the composition of those fragments is some alloy that is completely artificial that you don't find in nature, then it's something else. So what I'm talking about are, collection of quantitative measurements that indicate that it's something quite unusual. Now, we did have partial evidence of that type on Oumuamua, the first interstellar object reported. We have some partial information about this meteor that I mentioned from 2014, 4 years before Oumuamua, that my student Amir Siraj and I discovered, and the government confirmed a couple of months ago. And we know that this meteor was denser or tougher than iron because it burned only 20 kilometers above ocean level, where the stress is above, well above the yield stress of iron. So we know that it was unusual, but we don't know for sure what its origin was. And we know that it came from outside the solar system. So right now we have intriguing evidence. The same as for UAP. We don't have a conclusive argument at the moment, but that's why we should be motivated to find more data. And it always reminds me of my colleague that after a lecture at Harvard about Oumuamua, this colleague of mine focused on studying rocks for decades. So when he left the auditorium, he said to me, Oumuamua is so weird, I wish it never existed. And that is completely the opposite to what a scientist, a true scientist, should say. Obviously, an expert would like to interpret everything based on his or her past knowledge. But if you are a real scientist, you should say, this object is so intriguing, I would like to get more data on it. It's really exciting.
Lenin reportedly said, you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You might not be interested in aliens. But Eric, what extent should, you and I have talked extensively about the general demarcation, Popperian ideas, but at what level would you say to Avi, give it up, man? Oumuamua, it's like, in other words, what would it take for you and me, or maybe to convince Avi? And then Avi, I want to ask, what would you be convinced by that Oumuamua is not, as your book of the same name, phenomenal book, bestseller, smash hit, extraterrestrial? What would convince you, Avi? But first I want to ask Eric, is that a good question even to ask?
More or less my experience with Avi is that when Avi gets something wrong, he's eager to say that he's got it wrong. And that shouldn't be a remarkable characteristic of a scientist, I'm sorry to say. But, just the willingness to entertain being wrong, it's contagious and it's immediately recognizable. So my feeling is I don't really need to tell. It's not like Avi's under some kind of a watch and we have to say, like, maybe he's gone around the bend on Oumuamua. I think what he's doing is that he's trying to show conviction. And might Avi be wrong? Yes, it does not shock Avi that I think he might be wrong, and nor does it threaten our relationship. I think that we've got to take the MTV out of science in order to recognize that being wrong and making bold conjectures is normal. And if everything you've ever said is true and is right and works, you're probably not really pushing the cutting edge. I think that in terms of data, one of the great problems that we have here is that every time you try to take the perspective of somebody on the outside saying, well, maybe it's BS, maybe there's something there, I don't know. And you're talking to these people who are ex-government or aerospace contractors or in government. There's this very awkward moment where they get so frustrated with this, they say, I just wish I could show you what we have because it would end this conversation instantly. So the claim is made repeatedly by different people that what is held in terms of, like, I don't know, satellites that have tracked objects coming in from, outside of Earth orbit at incredible speeds and non-ballistic trajectories. The claim is that we have all sorts of crazy data that may not be very visual in the sense of, oh, look, a floating tic tac, but are scientifically much more interesting because let's say you have, 5 different sensors on the same object and you're absolutely convinced that it would be incredible to spoof all of them, or it would have to be a conspiracy or something. So the claim that is made repeatedly by people in positions with security clearances and the like is that the data is completely clear that we're dealing with a real phenomena. And that's really tough on me because I haven't seen anything that looks remotely like that. In other words, I'm so bored of these 3 tantalizing videos that got released and all of the cool stuff that's shot on people's iPhones. The other week I saw a supposed UAP video shot out of a plane in which a giant whale broke through the clouds and splashed back into the clouds as if they were the surface of the ocean. And I thought, well, that's much higher quality than most of the UFO videos I've ever seen. So in a weird sense, the video stuff as data, to Avi's point, is completely clear that it's not very helpful. What is claimed is that there is extremely high quality data that completely settles the question of whether we're looking at something real or not. I've never seen this data. I've heard it discussed many times. People have threatened to show it to me. People have threatened to fly me to a location. There's something that has happened every single time. So I now expect that I'm going to get some phone calls from people who claim to have this data, who claim that this is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. And it's not just me that this has happened to. It's repeatedly with various people. So I think that in part, whatever is going on here, it's a dime that was flipped and has landed on its side for like 75 years. And since a dime is not going to stay in an unstable equilibrium on its side, you have to ask the question, is that in fact a new piece of data? What does one make of the fact that a dime could land on its side for 70 years without clear data getting into the public's hands so that anybody with a competency can look at it and say, this is not consistent with anything known to man?
And Avi, well, let me just first reset the stage here. I'm talking with my friends, Dr. Eric Weinstein, proprietor of the Portal Podcast, and general raconteur, impresario, advisor, friend, and mentor to many.
All right, so that's Brian Keaton and Avi Loeb and Eric Weinstein. Great interview. I encourage you all to go and watch that. Unfortunately, I worked a lot today, and I have to work tomorrow. I'm tired.
That was great info, brother.
Yeah, some good stuff, man, and definitely people could go check it out because these guys are on board. Travis Taylor's on board. There's a number of these other guys that are coming out of the woodwork, like Jay Stratton, and some of these other people that they've mentioned. So our job is to make sure that all the information gets out to these people and gets out to the greater community, and that people know that
despite the censorship,
they're all talking about these groups, that there's a need for alternative propulsion groups. And I'm like, hey, we're here, APAC this Saturday. Hello. Come on now. Let's talk about
all
this.
people have to do is listen and partake, and that they just keep trying to stymie the information and stop it. Like, I had all my videos on Facebook removed last week just because they had a link to the alienscientist.com website on
Yeah,
them.
I saw that too. I had a number of my posts removed on Facebook because alienscientist.com triggered some things. So I'm trying to move the site over. I had to get a new host. It was on GoDaddy, and something happened with the it got corrupted. I don't know, or something, and it's super sketchy what happened. Everything got taken down, and
YouTube just removed my Crypto Alchemist channel today too, so I am pissed. Yeah, so I now have 2 channels removed by YouTube.
wow. Well, I hope I hope it doesn't happen to this channel. We're just gonna keep on
Right?
going.
And I tried backing it up to Odyssey yesterday, and something went wrong, and then today my channel's deleted. Like, just so pissed. We
They
really got to
got
get
they got
on
Richard
the other.
Gage's channel too. He had me on that channel a couple 2 weeks ago, and then he said he's been having trouble since then, and then it got shut down. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on, man.
It truly is. Like, if this isn't enough to prove to people that it is out there, I don't know what is.
Yeah, it's legit, man. So I don't know. I can't say much more for tonight, but I'm gonna leave people with that, and we'll have just know that Saturday is gonna be an epic conference. So tune in on Saturday, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, for the APEC Alternative Propulsion Engineering Conference, where we're going to talk some real physics and real science, and we're getting to the bottom of this one way or the other, the best way we can. So
Absolutely. Much love and respect, brother. Thank you for having me on.
thank you. All right, guys. Have a good night.